Stand where the fog rolls off the Pacific and imagine the place everyone pictures when they hear the word prison, a jagged rock rising from cold water, cell blocks stacked like a stone ribcage, searchlights sweeping the bay. That's Alcatraz, yes, the federal penitentiary that swallowed notorious lives between 1934 and 1963. But beneath that familiar silhouette there's a quieter, stranger story that keeps tugging at the edges of what we think we know. We arrive expecting hard facts, bureaucracy, escape attempts, guard towers. Instead, we find questions that look more like the kind of riddles archaeologists whisper over maps, traces of older lives, fragmented artifacts, and a loneliness carved by tides and time that makes any settled explanation feel thin. This is the tension at the heart of what we're doing together. You bring the curiosity, I bring the lantern, and we'll walk the shoreline where modern history and ancient mystery brush shoulders and refuse to stay polite. I promise, no cheap revelations, no facile closures. What I do promise is stories that will pull at the belief you have in tidy endings, and leave you with something more alive, the thrill of not knowing. Begin with the ordinary expectation and let it bend. You expect Alcatraz to answer a single kind of question, about criminals and punishment. But imagine Alcatraz as a thread in a much larger tapestry, an island whose name, in the language of Spanish mariners, meant pelican, Isla de los Alcatrazes, and yet which also became a marker on maps that guided ships along migration routes that native peoples had used for millennia. Imagine the same fog you know from the prison stories clinging to stones that held secrets long before federal wardens arrived. When we speak of ancient mysteries, we usually point to remote deserts and crumbling temples. But the Specter of Alcatraz asks us to consider how even places written into the modern mind for one thing can be palimpsests of many eras, each layer offering traces that refuse easy interpretation. We will go, together, to places that seem finished to most people, places with plaques, signs, and tidy summaries, and we will lift the edge of the map and peer into the strangeness beneath. We will follow artifacts that refuse to stay put geographically, trade routes that don't match the expected tempo of prehistory, and burial practices that suggest the unthinkable, contact, exchange, and ideas moving faster and farther than our models predict. You'll hear names of cultures and dates, the sure anchors historians want, but you'll also hear voices that ask for patience, new methods, new analyses, and new humility. Science has solved extraordinary things, but some clues persistently hover outside the neat battery of explanation. It's not that the clues contradict science, it's that they push science to the edge of what it can comfortably explain with current data. And that is an invitation, not an embarrassment. We will be authoritative, because we owe the truth to you. We will be conversational, because history is not a ledger, it's a living narrative. We will move from the foggy piers of San Francisco to the sunburnt plateaus of Anatolia, to lightning-struck moors in England, to wind-swept Polynesian cliffs, and back again, letting each location whisper its own contradictions. Along the way we'll measure things, distances, carbon dates, heights of monoliths, because numbers ground wonder in a way that invites skepticism and deeper imagination at the same time. We'll consider competing theories, sometimes contradictory, sometimes mutually exclusive, because mystery is not solved by refusing plausible alternatives. It is illuminated by laying them all on the table and weighing them honestly. Above all, we will leave the last word open. This script is a lantern in the dark, but not a declaration that the darkness has been conquered. Keep your hands on the railing. The view we're about to take in is breathtaking and, at times, unnerving. So let's begin, not as a lecture but as a conversation. Picture Alcatraz again, gulls circling, a thin mist hiding half the Golden Gate Bridge, the tide pushing itself like a slow and patient thought against the rocky shore. Picture yourself standing on the island at dawn, breathing the cold salt-tinged air, running your fingers along iron railings warmed by an early sun. Now broaden that picture. Picture the same kind of dawn, in a different latitude, where the light finds the eyes of carved stone faces watching out to the sea. Picture drifting campfires, the smell of fish drying on racks, the rhythmic beat of oars on an ocean that connects places we'd rather believe were ignorant of one another. Our task is to keep these pictures in mind, to let them sit side by side until their contradictions start to show. First, consider the island itself as a kind of case study in layered mystery. Archaeologists and historians have traced human presence on the shores of the San Francisco Bay for at least 6,000 years, with the Ohlone people, some call them Costanon in older literature, living in seasonal villages, fishing, trading, and managing the estuarine landscape. European contact in the 18th century changed everything. Spanish maps and missions redrew human networks with colonial lines. Yet when the fortifications were built in the mid-19th century and the prison later carved its strict order, the underlying natural and cultural rhythms did not vanish. Shell middens, tools, and oral histories point to earlier use of the islands in the bay for ritual and transit. The question that nags scholars is how much of that older footprint survives beneath the layers of military construction and 20th century bricks, and whether there are things there that would force us to revise assumptions about the movement of people and ideas along the Pacific coast. It's a local mystery, yes, but it resonates with broader puzzles. How often do modern landmarks sit atop older mysteries, and how many of those older stories never make it into the glossy tourist pamphlets? Now expand out from the island to other places where reverence and bafflement sit side by side. We will move through 6 to 8 extended segments in the chapters ahead. Each will focus on a single site, and each will demand that we juggle dates, artifacts, and hypotheses, all while keeping the mythic element swirling at the edges. There will be giants, in the sense that some discoveries suggest human figures beyond the ordinary. There will be lost tribes and voyagers whose craft could cross oceans we once thought impassable, and there will be stones arranged in patterns that still seem to pulse with calculation. We will examine the Antikythera Mechanism and the question of what it says about ancient engineering, Göbekli Tepe and the upheaval it forces on our timeline of civilization, the Nazca Lines and the possibility of large-scale planning long before central bureaucracies, Easter Island and the riddle of its statues, and, woven through all of it, the idea that Alcatraz's fog is not unique. Every coast and cliff has fogs of its own, layers of history that obscure and reveal in turns. But here's where it gets tricky. The temptation to walk into sensationalism is constant. Giant skeletons sell headlines, alien architects make great memes. We will not surrender to those temptations. We will, instead, balance the mythic language that captures the imagination with the skepticism that protects the story from easy falsification. When myth appears, a cursed stone, a lost voyage, a tribe that vanished overnight, we will let it sit like smoke in a room that also contains careful radiocarbon dates and measured artifact typologies. Our approach honors the human impulse for wonder without abandoning the careful work of science. The result is not a denial of magic but a recontextualization of it. Sometimes the most mythical explanations are metaphors for social processes we have yet to fully understand. Sometimes the myth preserves a kernel of memory that the archaeological record struggles to capture. Either way, the tension is where the story really lives. Picture yourself now walking the foggy trail at dawn on Alcatraz, but with the imagination wide enough to extend that walk across oceans and epochs. The sea that hits Alcatraz's rocks also laps at the isles of the Pacific and the shores of Anatolia. People moved, traded, grieved, and rearranged stone in ways that both conceal and reveal. That is the rhythm we will chase, traces that flicker like signals across time, sometimes coherent, sometimes contradictory. We will hold fact and fable together and, when we must choose, we'll favor the evidence. Yet we'll leave space for the human story. The ache that made someone stack stone a certain way, bury their dead with a certain tool, or carve a face from basalt and set it facing the sea. Keep your skepticism handy, and keep your sense of awe intact. We'll test theories against measurements, kilometers of trade routes, isotope values, stratigraphic layers, and we'll also listen to the stories people tell about the places where their ancestors lived. If history is a ledger, myth is an annotation, both matter. In the segments to come, we'll see how a single carved stone can speak to engineering prowess and religious devotion at once, how a pattern on a plane can be both a map and a manifesto, how a mechanism made of bronze and gears can challenge our assumptions about the tempo of technological innovation. These contradictions are not failures of method, they are the raw material of discovery. Now let us begin the first of our deep dives, a segment that foregrounds Alcatraz itself, not merely as a mid-20th century penitentiary but as a node in a coastline of mysteries. We'll treat it as a single-sentence teaser first. Alcatraz, an island of punishment that holds older echoes of sacred crossings and coastal engineering, and then stretch that sentence into a full account. Imagine again the island's small footprint, roughly 22 acres, a few hundred meters across at its widest, a cold current thudding on its base. Think of the measurements. The lighthouse standing at about 82 feet, the cell blocks arranged along a narrow ridge, and then reflect on measurements that matter archaeologically. Shell midden depths measured in meters, charcoal flecks that radiocarbon between roughly 4,000 and 2,000 years before present in nearby mainland sites, and trade items like obsidian or clamshell beads that speak of networks rather than isolation. Here's the complication. The standard narrative of Alcatraz focuses on its European and federal uses, but the physical evidence of pre-contact activity across the bay suggests sustained circulation. What exactly that circulation looked like, and whether it included ritualized uses of islands specifically for liminal acts like initiations or seasonal ceremonies, is still under debate. Key discoveries include midden layers recorded on nearby islands and shorelines, obsidian geochemical signatures that match inland sources hundreds of kilometers away, and ethnohistoric accounts recorded by early ethnographers that hint at ritual routes the Ohlone and other groups used. There are reports, for example, of shell bead exchange systems that could function as currency across significant stretches of the coast. If these trade routes were more active and integrated than previously thought, it would shift our models of social complexity along the Pacific coast. It would also force a reassessment of how islands like Alcatraz function socially, not only as prisons in the modern sense, but as places with long inherited meanings. Now, let's be fair, much of the detailed archaeological work on Alcatraz itself was disrupted by the island's military and penitentiary uses. The stratigraphy is messy, and demolition and construction removed or disturbed many contexts. Still, for all the evidence that has been lost, the preserved traces demand attention. Competing theories attempt to make sense of these traces. The conservative position argues that while coastal trade existed, it was episodic and ceremonial rather than constituting dense, integrated networks comparable to, say, the Mississippian chiefdoms in North America. Another hypothesis suggests that islands served as ritual hubs precisely because their physical separation created ritualized thresholds. In this model, Alcatraz might have been a site for rites of passage or negotiations with other groups. A more adventurous theory posits that coastal populations engaged in long-distance mariner networks that facilitated significant exchange and even the spread of complex ideas, perhaps technologies of boat building or agricultural knowledge, across far greater distances than we once imagined. And then there's a mythic overlay. Stories of ghostly figures and enormous carved stones moved across the water, a narrative that likely blends remembered practice with later romanticization. We still don't know which of these models captures the full truth, or whether the truth is a braided mix of all of them. Picture yourself again walking the foggy trail at dawn, this time with a shell bead in your palm. Think about the hands that shaped it, the voyage that bead took, the ceremonies it may have witnessed. Imagine, too, the strange thought that Alcatraz's cold rock has absorbed centuries of voices, some of them recorded in archives, most of them not. Reflect on what it means when a place famous for incarceration is also a place that holds the echoes of older freedoms, seasonal travel, ritual thresholds, and maritime expertise. That contradiction, that layering, is the seed of the larger pattern we'll return to: modern landmarks that both preserve and obscure ancient textures. We will move next, in the segment that follows, to a very different latitude and altitude, to a site that utterly upended scholars' expectations of how civilization began. But for now, keep the image of Alcatraz, a small island, 22 acres of stone and story, standing in turbulent water, a place whose modern fame is only the latest coat of paint on a much older artifact. Keep the sense that every well-known place has underlayers. Keep your hands on the railing, breathe in the salt, and let the fog do its work, obscuring, revealing, and compelling you to look more closely. We still don't know how many stories lie beneath that paint. The tide keeps its own counsel as we step away from Alcatraz's iron and mortar and head inland in time and imagination, to a place that forced scholars to tear up the tidy timeline of civilization, Göbekli Tepe. Picture a hilltop in southeast Anatolia, the wind rubbing the grasses into bands, the sky immense and indifferent. One-sentence teaser: Göbekli Tepe, a ring of carved pillars raised by people who, by every comfortable assumption, should not yet have been building temples. Now let's stretch that line into the full bewildering sweep. The site sits roughly 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Sanliurfa, ancient Edessa, for a later name, and its most dramatic structures were hewn and set between about 9,600 and 8,200 BC, yes, that early, a full 12,000 years ago or more, placing it squarely in the Upper Paleolithic to Early Neolithic transition. The stone pillars reach up to 5.5 meters in height in some enclosures and are often T-shaped, carved with reliefs of animals, foxes, boars, scorpions, serpents, and abstract motifs that repeat like a stubborn chorus. The scale is impressive: enclosures of packed stone, carved basalt or limestone, set in deliberate orientations that would have required coordinated labor, planning, and a reason to summon people together, all before full-scale agriculture becomes common in the region. That mismatch between monumental architecture and a supposedly mobile, hunting-gathering subsistence has been the source of the controversy and the thrill. Archaeologists found layers of intentional backfilling that suggest repeated cycles: build, use, bury, and build again, as if communities invested in and then ritually interred these sacred rings. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal and other organic remains cluster around those millennia, giving us the firm chronological anchors we crave. But the social and economic picture refuses neatness. On the one hand, the scale of labor implies some form of social organization that could muster dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people for coordinated effort. On the other, botanical and faunal evidence indicates that many people in the region were still heavily reliant on wild resources. So what fed and housed the workforce? How did they carry out quarrying, shaping of pillars, and transport without the later hallmarks of settled, surplus-producing societies? Various lines of data, from tool assemblages, chipped stone distribution, to microscopic wear on grinding stones, suggest an in-between economy, localized grain processing and early forms of plant management combined with continued hunting and gathering. In short, the site sits at a hinge: human groups on the edge of domestication, but not yet the full agrarian complexes we often associate with monumental architecture. Key discoveries include not only the pillars themselves but carved stone heads, animal reliefs with astonishing detail, and layers containing bone fragments that hint at feasting events. The presence of large amounts of animal bone in certain layers suggests communal meals, perhaps tied to ritual events that necessitated drawdowns of wild herds and collective gatherings. There are also traces of flint workshops, knapping debris and specialized tools that point to craft specialization. Measurements matter here: enclosures some 10 to 30 meters across, pillars weighing multiple tons, quarry sites potentially kilometers away, all implying logistics that are not incidental. When you tally the energy cost of cutting, transporting, raising, and carving such pillars, the investment is immense. One persuasive argument suggests that the site functioned as a pilgrimage center. People traveled in seasonal pulses, bringing resources, exchanging news, and participating in communal rituals. That model explains episodic aggregation and would ease the logistical puzzle, but it raises more questions about what beliefs or social mechanisms motivated such repeated pilgrimages. Competing theories attempt to stitch these observations into coherent narratives. The conservative interpretation frames Göbekli Tepe as part of a slow, incremental process of sedentism and food production. The stones mark a community that was in the earliest throes of settling down, learning to cultivate and store enough to free some hands for monumental labor. Another influential theory pushes harder. Perhaps ritual architecture itself precipitated the shift to agriculture. The argument goes like this: large ritual sites required stable seasonal returns and reliable food surpluses. To secure those surpluses, people started to manage plants more deliberately, gradually leading to domestication. In that reading, religion, or organized ritual life, catalyzed the agricultural revolution, not the other way around. Still, for all that reasoning, there remains a stubborn opacity. The iconography at Göbekli Tepe does not map neatly onto later Neolithic religions in Anatolia and the Levant, nor does it align tidily with mythic structures in the region's later recorded traditions. Mythic overlay creeps in at this point, tales of skypeople or giants who taught humans to harness grain, or of a lost priestly caste that shaped the foundations of later kingship. These narratives are seductive, giving a single-named villain or hero to a complex social transformation, but they risk oversimplifying a process that probably involved many groups over centuries. Picture yourself walking into a circular enclosure at dawn, torchlight flickering on carved animals that seem to prop their weight on symbolic shoulders. Feel the grit of ground limestone underfoot, the smell of hearth smoke rising from deep pits, the murmur of a crowd long since dust. Imagine the hands that hammered and chiseled those figures, the laughter of a feast, the quiet conversation about which seasons would bring the herds. Imagine someone planting an early strain of rye in a patch near the hill's base, and keeping a careful eye on its seedlings because the group expects to return, again and again, to the same sacred center. What that human tableau reveals is not merely ritual, but a social strategy, building identity through shared sacred projects. That insight folds Göbekli Tepe into a broader human pattern. The idea that meaning-making often precedes state-making, that communal religion can be both glue and engine for social change. Still, for all the evidence, the site refuses closure. We don't have a written record, at least not yet, that explains the metaphors carved into the stone or the precise sequence of social decisions that led to these constructions. The plain fact remains: people chose to invest massive labor and monumentality at a time when the economic preconditions we usually expect to support such labor were not fully present. That asymmetry is a provocation to our models and a reminder that social life is not a linear staircase. We still don't know what combination of ritual, social obligation, climatic pressure, or visionary leadership produced Göbekli Tepe's rings. From Göbekli Tepe we drift west across continents and centuries to the sharp bronze edge of the Aegean, where the sea keeps its own mechanical secrets. One-sentence teaser: the Antikythera Mechanism, a battered assembly of bronze gears found in a shipwreck, hints that Hellenistic engineers reached depths of mechanical sophistication that surprise even modern specialists. The wreck that gave us the mechanism sits off the tiny island of Antikythera, between Crete and mainland Greece, discovered by sponge divers in 1900. The machine itself dates to the late 2nd or early 1st century BC, and what survived was encrusted bronze fragments that, once cleaned and X-rayed, revealed interlocking gears arranged to track celestial cycles, the sun's and moon's motions, the metonic cycle of 235 lunar months approximating 19 solar years, and even the Saros cycle tied to eclipses. There are dials that likely displayed the progression of the zodiac, and reconstructions suggest a mechanism capable of predicting eclipses and modeling planetary cycles with surprising accuracy. The precision of the gear teeth, their spacing, the subtlety of their compound gear trains, seem to come from a mechanical tradition far more sophisticated than we had expected for the period. The scale of the find, a device roughly the size of a shoebox, weighing under 5 kilograms in its original form, belies the depth of knowledge required to design and manufacture it. The Antikythera Mechanism suggests a tradition of analog computing in the ancient Mediterranean, but frustratingly, it appears to be a rare survivor of a kind of craftsmanship often lost to time because bronze corrodes and wooden and leather supports vanish. Key discoveries include inscriptions with Greek text that name celestial cycles, gear fragments whose tooth counts can be mapped to mathematical ratios, and contextual artifacts from that particular shipwreck, amphorae, statuary, and personal items that indicate a Hellenistic trading voyage. Scholars debate whether the mechanism represents a pinnacle of a continuous mechanical tradition stretching back into the Hellenistic era, perhaps influenced by Babylonian astronomical arithmetic and Egyptian timekeeping, or whether it was an isolated genius's workshop product, an outlier that didn't seed a larger manufacturing trend. Competing theories fall into a few productive camps. One camp argues for an indigenous Hellenistic mechanical tradition. Engineers, possibly associated with the likes of Hipparchus or Archimedes, developed gear-based instruments that were used in scholarly circles, perhaps by planetary modelers in places like Rhodes or Alexandria. In this view, the mechanism is the material evidence of a written but lost tradition of mechanical treatises. Another view sees the device as the result of cross-cultural knowledge flows, Greek mathematics combining with Mesopotamian cyclical astronomy and Egyptian technological know-how. Yet another theory entertains the possibility of even earlier antecedents. Ancient craftsmen in the Bronze Age Aegean might have experimented with geared devices for calendrical or ritual use, but their artifacts didn't survive. Mythic stories proliferate in popular culture. Precision machines made by priest engineers who read the future in bronze, or even the romantic fantasy of a single polymath constructing an artifact whose secrets were swallowed by the sea. Those narratives capture imagination but must be measured against the stubborn material facts: gear tooth counts, spacing, inscriptions, and the metallurgy that points toward workshops capable of precision casting and machining. Picture the wreck beneath slow ocean currents, amphorae scattered like the lost words of a book, and the mechanism, a kind of analog brain, lying among them. Picture a sailor or scholar cradling the device, watching the dials and noting the march of the sun and moon, the hints of eclipse. Imagine the conversations that followed. If the Saros repeats, we can forecast a shadow. Imagine also the manual skill required to cut bronze gear teeth with uniformity without modern machine tools. The Antikythera Mechanism forces us to appreciate that intellectual sophistication can flourish in devices whose traces are rare and fragile. It reminds us that technological genius does not always leave a clear, continuous lineage. Sometimes knowledge blooms and then withers, only to be glimpsed centuries later. Still, for all the modeling and computerized reconstructions, some crucial questions resist certainty. Did similar devices circulate widely among Hellenistic scholars, or was this machine a single commissioned instrument, perhaps for a wealthy patron or temple? How were such devices used in practice, for religious prediction, maritime navigation, or scholarly demonstration? And did their mathematical logic influence other domains of Hellenistic life in ways we have yet to see? We still don't know. We will continue, traveling through plains, deserts, and ocean cliffs in the chapters ahead, letting each site complicate the neat story we tell about human progress. Keep the image of the mechanism, bronze teeth interlocking like the gears of thought, and the carved pillars at Göbekli Tepe, pillars that anchor ritual to landscape. Both remind us that the human appetite for understanding and for meaning-making has always been material. Tools, stones, and bronze are the handwriting of our collective curiosity. Keep your hands steady. The next place we'll visit bends the horizon again, a plain of lines in the high desert of Peru that insist on being seen from above. We still don't know. From the Aegean we cross an ocean of sand and sky to the high desert of southern Peru, where the earth itself seems to have been given over to a single, sustained line of intent, the Nazca Desert's geoglyphs. Nazca, a sweep of saltandstone plateau between the coast and the Andes, yields its mystery in broad strokes. One-sentence teaser and then the slow, careful unfolding. The Nazca Lines are enormous figures and straight lines scraped into the desert floor, some of them running uninterrupted across the plain for distances measured in kilometers, and some iconic animal and geometric forms stretching hundreds of meters from nose to tail. Scholars date the creation of many of these figures to roughly between 200 BC and 600 CE, a period when the Nazca culture, agriculturalists who tended terraces, canals, and complex pottery traditions in the river valleys below, flourished. The scale is astonishing. Airplanes passing overhead found figures so large they are only legible from the sky, and while the region's hyperarid climate has preserved these scraped surfaces for centuries, the human logic behind them remains contested. How do you explain an artistic project on the level of a city-wide canvas when the people making it built their daily lives close to the narrow river valleys and not on the plateau itself? What social force, ritual practice, or practical need produced lines that can be read only from an aerial vantage? Archaeological fieldwork, aerial surveys, and ethnographic analogies have given us many of the hard facts. The soil structure of the plateau is a dark oxidized surface over a lighter subsoil that becomes visible when the top layer is cleared, making the lines enduring. Radiocarbon dating of hearths and associated materials helps anchor the period of activity to the Nazca era. And careful mapping has catalogued hundreds of individual forms: spiders, monkeys, hummingbirds, and geometric trapezoids, along with astonishingly straight pathways that ignore obstacles and climb slopes as if indifferent to the ground's inconveniences. The sheer logistics, coordinating the layout of a figure hundreds of meters across without a vantage point above the ground, suggest methods of surveying and communal labor that deserve our attention. Some scholars reconstruct the process by which teams could lay out scaled grids and employ simple sighting poles to produce the large designs, implying a communal, possibly ritual, execution rather than a handful of artists working in secret. We also know that the region's people were intensively managing water through subterranean aquifers and pukios, underground canals, in neighboring valleys, an engineering achievement that speaks to sustained organization and communal projects. The question is not whether the Nazca people were capable of great collaborative work, they were, but why the desert itself was chosen as a canvas in shapes meant for the sky. Competing explanations try to account for both the lines' design and their scale. One influential hypothesis treats the lines as ritual pathways, routes that would be walked in processions designed to plead with or celebrate the forces that control water and fertility. In this interpretation, the long straight lines are not images to be seen from the sky, so much as pilgrim roads written on the land for those who travel them on foot. Another view reads astronomical intent into the lines. Certain alignments appear to match solar or stellar risings on significant dates, suggesting that some lines could mark calendrical observances or be markers in a ritualized observation of the heavens. There are also hydrological theories that suggest the geoglyphs relate to water sources, perhaps as markers of subterranean water or as symbolic invocations to attract rain. On the more mythic end, writers and some popular theorists have proposed that the lines were messages to sky beings, a hypothesis made famous in early 20th century speculation and then amplified by modern sensationalism about ancient astronauts. These narratives are alluring. The idea of messages carved into the earth for otherworldly visitors satisfies a certain romance about epic encounters across time. Yet the material record seldom needs extraterrestrials to produce wonder. The Nazca Lines, like many monumental human acts, are as likely to be encoded with local cosmologies and social meanings as they are to be signals to the heavens of some universal commerce. Picture yourself walking the plateau at first light, when the desert cools and the horizon softens. You tread near a straight line so precise your footfall seems nearly sacrilegious. Its edge, visible against the paler subsoil, slices the landscape with an authority not of nature but of deliberate human measurement. Imagine communities gathering on the valley floors with woven storage bags of maize and beans, with pottery painted in complex patterns, and with ritual paraphernalia that could have been brought to the plateau on ceremonial days. Picture people forming processional bands, elders with staffs, singers chanting invocations for rainfall, young people carrying offerings. Hear the wind making a thin, metallic sound in the wires and the straps. Smell the smoke of a hearth lit in a temporary camp. Imagine also the aerial vantage point, a visual logic that eluded the builders but that later observers would read into the lines. Perhaps the Nazca did not intend the sky as the primary viewer. Perhaps the message was twofold, to be read from the ground by the initiated and to be visible from above as a way of connecting earthly ritual with celestial power. That ambiguity, between what was intended and what was later perceived, is central to the Nazca enigma. Still, for all the mapping and modeling, certain tensions remain. Why invest labor in drawing an animal whose science of meaning we can only guess at? Why place geometric forms near other figures whose iconography ties to local myths and agricultural rites? Why sustain such a program across centuries if it served only fleeting ritual episodes? Some suggest that the figures may have functioned as mnemonic devices, loci for stories, genealogies, or treaties that bound groups together across valleys. Others suggest a more practical origin. The lines might be a visible claim to territory, a way of writing ownership into the very skin of the land, readable to those with the necessary cosmological literacy. The Nazca maintain their mystery because they sit at the intersection of visible labor, sacred performance, and an economy intimately tied to water in a place where water was the difference between life and death. We still don't know the full script those lines were meant to perform. From the flat canvas of the Nazca we move out across a swell of Pacific to a remote rock in the ocean where upright figures look out as if keeping watch, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, with its monumental stone heads and the more complete human drama coded into their heft. One-sentence teaser: Rapa Nui, an island of colossal statues whose very making and transportation tell a story of human greatness and near catastrophe. The moai, those brooding faces carved mostly from the island's volcanic tuff at the quarry of Reino Raraku, range from a few meters to giants over 10 meters tall. One famous statue, Paro, approaches roughly 10 meters in height and is estimated to weigh some 82 tons. The majority of moai exhibit exaggerated head-to-body ratios, yet they represent a repetitive project of carving, transporting, erecting, and eventually toppling in a drama that unfolded, scholars suggest, mainly between about 1200 and 1600 CE, though the island's first settlers likely arrived earlier, perhaps around 800 to 1200 CE. In voyages that demonstrate Polynesian navigational skill. The sheer ambition of moving and erecting such statues on an island of only some 163 square kilometers suggests both social organization and a cultural logic that invested extraordinary resources in ancestor commemoration or ritual power. Archaeologists have documented quarry sites, transport roads, and collapsed statues in locations distant from their quarries. They have also examined pollen cores and soil records that indicate substantial deforestation between the island's colonization and the early modern period. The classic narrative assembled from these threads is cinematic. Settlers arrive, they build a culture around ancestor statues, they clear forests to transport and erect the moai, the island's ecology collapses, resources fail, social strife grows, and by the time Europeans arrive in the 18th century the society is fragmented and largely unable to sustain previous levels of complexity. This narrative has been powerful, but also contested. Newer studies introduce nuance. Some pollen records suggest periods of forest regeneration, and the presence of the Polynesian rat, introduced by voyagers, complicates the idea that humans alone were to blame for deforestation. Experimental archaeology has shown creative ways statues could be moved without large trees, and oral histories remind us that social collapse is rarely linear or absolute. Competing theories attempt to disentangle the social meaning of the moai and the environmental narrative. The conventional ecological collapse theory argues that the island's population overshot its resource base, leading to deforestation and soil erosion that undermined food production and precipitated social breakdown. In this view, the moai project is seen as part of an unsustainable social competition for prestige and land, a costly signaling system. Another perspective emphasizes resilience and adaptation. Communities engineered terraced agriculture, rock gardens, and water management to cope with limited soils, and the islanders' cultural innovations mitigated some of the pressures. Regarding statue movement, one camp favors a walked hypothesis, where teams use ropes and rocking motions to walk the moai upright across the landscape, a solution that reduces the need for timber sledges and suggests a high degree of social coordination and ritual performance. Another camp highlights sledges and rollers as practical technologies, suggesting that if trees had been present initially, they could have been used without implying inevitable collapse. Mythic narratives of giant ancestors, of a race of statue builders imbued with supernatural strength, color the popular imagination and sometimes obscure the documentary subtlety of the islanders' lifeways. Picture yourself on a basalt shore at sunrise, the sea glittering like a sheet of hammered metal, and moai silhouettes rising inland like guardians of a buried story. Imagine carvers on a rocky slope, hammering away with basalt picks at the tuff, chipping faces out of stone as if coaxing personality out of rock. Hear the chant that might accompany the hauling, feel the strain in the ropes, and see the hairline cracks in the island's tree trunks where humans have tested their limits. Imagine the social meanings, ancestors made present to support claims of lineage, identity, and political standing. Imagine also the later centuries when many statues were toppled, not simply as evidence of cultural decline, but possibly as the result of ritual conflict, political shifts, or deliberate iconoclasm in a changing religious landscape. These possibilities place the moai not only in an environmentalist story but in a human story of negotiation, performance, and remembrance. Still, for all the fieldwork, dating, and experimental reconstructions, essential questions linger. Did statue building accelerate ecological strain or reflect a complex social order that managed to endure longer than first supposed? To what extent were the Moai project and later cultural shifts tied to internal social competition versus external shocks, such as disease introduced by European contacts? Were the toppled statues the result of deliberate iconoclasm, peaceful retirement, or collapse-driven abandonment? We still don't know the full mix of causes, and that indeterminacy is part of what keeps Rapa Nui's story compelling. It is a human chronicle writ large in stone, a reminder that monumental art and ecological stress can entangle in unpredictable ways. As the ocean air clears and the island silhouettes recede, let us hold these images, Nazca's lines like a written breath across a plain, Rapa Nui's Moai standing sentry over an intimate island world, in mind. Each place gives us measurements, dates, and data. Each also throws us back into narrative choices among competing explanations. We are learning to be historians who listen for the hum beneath the facts, the ritual heartbeat, the logistic cough, the human stubbornness that pushes a stone uphill or draws a line straight across a desert. We still don't know the full texture of any of these stories, but each unanswered question is an invitation. Keep your lantern tilted forward. The next stretch of coastline and plateau calls us onward into other human projects that refuse to be simple. We step from island and ocean and plain into a low-rolling English landscape where stone circles knit the sky to the ground and time seems to collect in a single horizon line. Picture Salisbury Plain with its wind and sheep, the bluish gray of stone against chalk, and then imagine a ring set down by hands thousands of years ago. One-sentence teaser, Stonehenge, a calibrated choreography of sarsen's and bluestones that keeps pointing to the same questions about purpose, power, and precision. The site evolved across centuries, with the first large-scale earthworks, ditches and banks, cut around 3100 BC, while the iconic megalithic phase that raised the Great Sarsen Trilithons is generally dated to about 2500 BC, placing the monument squarely in the late Neolithic into the early Bronze Age. The largest sarsens weigh up to 25 tons or more and stand nearly 9 meters tall, while the smaller bluestones, many transported from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, average 1 to 4 tons each and present a logistical puzzle. How and why were these particular stones taken across hundreds of kilometers? The measurements matter. Lines of sight across the site align with the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice to within a degree. And Aubrey holes and nearby barrows, burial mounds, suggest an intimate relationship between the living and their dead. When we measure the labor, the pick marks on the stones, and the landscape shaping through ditches and banks, we confront the reality that Stonehenge was not an accidental arrangement but a planned, long-term project that required organized labor, accumulated skills, and a cultural logic that valued monumentality. Archaeologists have dug thousands of test pits and radiocarbon-dated organic remains that bracket phases of construction, cremation burials in the late Neolithic, the deposition of human remains in nearby features, and evidence of activity over many generations. Geochemical analyses of the bluestones confirm their sources in the Preseli Hills, about 200 to 250 kilometers away, though the exact route, coastal shipping versus overland hauling and intermittent reuse of stones, is debated. Key discoveries also include antler picks used as quarrying tools, the remains of feasting debris that indicate communal gatherings, and timber circles that predate some of the stone phases, suggesting that the site's history is one of layering and redefinition. Now, let's be fair, the visible stones we see today are only the survivors of a long story that began with earthworks and timber, and the socio-political context, who commissioned the work, how labor was organized, whether the site served one community or many, remains contested. But the presence of cremation burials and the sheer expense of moving stones suggest deep ritual or ideological motives, perhaps ancestor veneration, perhaps cosmological mapping, perhaps elite competition to create visible claims on the landscape. Competing theories range across a productive spectrum. One prominent idea casts Stonehenge as an astronomical observatory. Alignments mark solstices, lunar standstills, and possibly other celestial events, allowing communities to anchor ritual calendars and agricultural cycles to predictable heavenly motions. This school reminds us that pre-modern people measured sky and season with meticulous care. Another interpretation frames the site as a ritual landscape for the dead. The concentration of burials and the procession routes from the River Avon suggests processional or funerary use, a place where the living negotiated with deceased lineage. A third theory sees Stonehenge as a healing center, a proposal driven by isotope studies showing that some individuals buried there were born far from the region, implying pilgrimage and perhaps belief in curative properties of the stones themselves. And then there's the competitive or prestige-building explanation. Chiefs or networks may have commissioned ever larger stones to outdo rivals, turning monument building into costly signaling that bolstered their social status. Mythic overlays, giants who flung stones into place, or sky spirits that ordered the cosmos, animate folklore and modern imagination alike. But myths aside, the measured, repeatable data, radiocarbon sequences, stone sourcing, and landscape archaeology pushes us to accept that Stonehenge operated on multiple registers: astronomical, funerary, symbolic, and political, often simultaneously. Picture yourself standing within a ring of stones as dawn slants across the plain. The light bisects the lintels, your breath fogs in the cool air, and the ghost of a procession seems to hang there, half-remembered. Imagine those hands hauling bluestones across estuaries or sliding sarcens into place with rope, the chant and the strain, the smell of peat fires on the wind. But here's where it gets tricky. Stonehenge's multifunctionality resists tidy categorization. Was it primarily an observatory that accrued social uses, or a burial monument that also tracked celestial time? Did long-distance visitors bring ideas that altered local practices, or did local innovation arise from practical needs tied to agriculture and social memory? Some isotopic evidence suggests mobility among certain buried individuals, while excavation layers show repeated reworking of the site, as if successive generations refashioned its meaning. The truth may be that the monument was an engine of social memory that adapted its role as the communities who used it evolved. Still, for all the elegant models and measured data, we still don't know. We leave the chalk and move into the Nile's dim hush, to an ordered geometry that sits under a desert sun and over millennia of royal ambition, the Great Pyramid of Giza. One-sentence teaser: the Pyramid of Khufu, a near-flawless architectural achievement of the 4th dynasty, precisely aligned and massive to an extent that continues to press against our understanding of ancient engineering. Built around 2580 to 2560 BC for Pharaoh Khufu, Cheops in Greek, the pyramid originally rose to about 146.6 meters and now stands at roughly 138.8 meters due to centuries of erosion and the loss of outer casing stones. Its base stretches about 230.4 meters per side, and estimates of its structure point to around 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of approximately 2.5 tons per block, though some blocks, especially certain granite elements, weigh many times that. The precision with which the base is leveled and the sides aligned almost exactly to the cardinal points, within a few arc minutes according to recent measurements, demands an explanation. How did a society thousands of years ago achieve such surveying accuracy across a foundation over 230 meters on a side? Inside are chambers, the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber with its granite sarcophagus, narrow shafts whose purposes remain debated, and a complexity of internal passageways that complicates the simple tomb narrative. Archaeology here is buttressed by documentary fragments and workers' graffiti. The discovery of the papyri of Mir, logbooks from an official overseeing parts of the pyramid project, proves that organized logistics, including the transport of limestone down the Nile, were central to the construction. Workers' villages, bakeries, and cemeteries discovered at Giza indicate a sizable, salaried workforce rather than nameless slaves, shifting popular narratives about how ancient Egyptians organized monumental labor. Technological analyses of quarry marks, copper tools, and sledging techniques give us models for how stone could be worked and moved. But the precise method of raising the blocks into place remains debated. Proposals include external straight ramps, spiral ramps encircling the rising pyramid, and internal ramp hypotheses that posit a system of internal passageways used as a lifting plane. Jean-Pierre Houdin's internal ramp theory, for example, suggests an inner spiraling ramp that reduces the need for massive external earthworks. Critics point to the lack of direct archaeological evidence for such a ramp inside the structure and remind us that ancient builders were ingenious with temporary external ramps and leveraging. The geometry is equally compelling. Alignments that match cardinal directions, solutions for load distribution in corbelled roofing, and attention to ventilation and chamber orientation suggest knowledge of sophisticated planning and an aesthetic prioritization of symbolic order. Competing theories often reflect different emphases. Engineering-focused models aim to reconstruct the step-by-step logistics of construction and the mechanical innovations that made the edifice possible. Socio-political readings emphasize statecraft, resource mobilization, and the ideological imperatives that legitimated pharaohic power through monumental architecture. Religious interpretations underline the pyramid's role as an axis mundi, a machine for ensuring the king's resurrection and cosmic order. Fringe theories, whether romanticizing lost technologies or invoking extraterrestrial aid, appeal to modern cravings for an easy mystery solver and tend to collapse under scrutiny of the archaeological and textual record. Still, mythic language, of giants hauling stone, of kings who commanded the world into being, persists because the pyramid's scale provokes awe. Picture yourself standing at the base, the limestone biting at the throat of the sky, the shadow moving slowly across an immensity of stone cut and placed with uncanny regularity. Hear the imagined noise of a workforce, sledges creaking, ropes groaning, and read the graffiti of labor gangs that reveal a human story of organization and pride. Now, let's be fair, the existence of papyri like mirror confirms organized labor and a Nile-borne logistics chain, but papyri do not map every stage of construction and do not explain every engineering decision. For all the evidence of managers, draftsmen, quarry camps, and a supply chain, some mechanical and architectural details resist full reconstruction. We still don't know. From the ordered geometry of Giza we travel to a sunlit plateau in southeastern Africa where an immense stone complex folds around a hill like an ancient citadel, Great Zimbabwe. One-sentence teaser, Great Zimbabwe, a dry stone metropolis of towering walls and soapstone birds that test our assumptions about indigenous urbanism and long-distance trade in medieval Africa. The site flourished roughly from the 11th to the 15th centuries CE and is centered on a hilltop complex and an adjacent valley enclosure whose walls, built without mortar from coarse granite blocks, reach heights up to 11 meters and encircle areas hundreds of meters across. The great enclosure has a circumference of some 250 meters and contains a conical tower whose function remains debated. Stone walls here are not merely fortifications but also statements of continuity in craft. The stonework is skillful, regularly coursed, and visually imposing. Archaeological surveys and excavations have recovered numerous artifacts that point to trade networks extending to the Swahili coast and beyond, glass beads with Indian and possibly Persian origins, Chinese and Islamic ceramics, and gold-working residues that hint at local metallurgy integrated into regional commerce. Key stratigraphic dates, luminescence dating of pottery, and historical cross-references place Great Zimbabwe's peak in the high medieval period, aligning with the global currents of Indian Ocean trade. The site's artisans fashioned soapstone birds, stylized avian sculptures about 30 to 50 centimeters tall, that have become emblematic of the complex, their symbolic meaning likely tied to royal iconography or spiritual intermediaries. Recent scholarship emphasizes the indigenous origins of the site, a conclusion that corrects earlier colonial-era assertions which attributed the ruins to outsiders like Phoenicians or Arabs out of racial prejudice. Excavations reveal evidence of cattle husbandry, agricultural terraces, and social stratification indicated by differential housing and artifact concentrations. The scale of stone construction and the density of occupation suggest a political center with elites who controlled trade flows and social authority over a hinterland. Competing theories negotiate the site's primary functions. Some scholars emphasize state formation, Great Zimbabwe as the capital of a centralized polity that regulated trade and extractive industries, notably gold, and projected authority through monumental architecture. Others view the site as a ritual and economic hub, a place where sacred kingship was enacted through stone, craft, and controlled access to exotic goods, thereby reinforcing social hierarchies without strict centralized bureaucracies. The international trade evidence provokes questions about how connected inland polities were to the maritime world. Were caravans and trade networks run by local elites who brokered goods to and from coastal Swahili towns? Or did external merchants play a dominant role in shaping inland economic patterns? Mythic tales about lost tribes, golden empires, or foreign architects sometimes resurface in popular narratives, but material culture, beads, ceramics, agricultural tools, affirms local creativity and long-distance exchange. Picture yourself walking the dry stone passages at dusk, the heat of the day radiating out from the walls, and imagine a market where glass beads glint like water and a soapstone bird sits on a plinth as a silent witness to deals that stretch to the Indian Ocean. Feel the hand of a mason smoothing granite into courses, the taste of porridge cooked over earthen fires, the murmur of negotiation in tongues layered with Swahili, Shona, and other languages. Still, for all the mapping, dating, and artifact networks, central questions persist. How exactly did Great Zimbabwe's political economy function at its fullest complexity? What internal social relations sustained its stone building and craft production? And how did external trade rhythms shape local life? Did climatic shifts influence its rise and decline, or were political realignments more decisive? These are subtle puzzles with multiple plausible answers. We still don't know. We will keep moving, following these threads, stone, bronze, line, and bone, outwards and inwards, never satisfied with tidy endings. Keep your lantern ready. More horizons await, each demanding that we balance measured skepticism with the human hunger for wonder. All these places we have walked together, Alcatraz's fog-laced rock, Göbekli Tepe's carved rings, the bronze teeth of the Antikythera Mechanism, the vast script of the Nazca Plain, Rapa Nui's solitary sentinels, Stonehenge's calibrated stones, Giza's massive stones, Great Zimbabwe's coursed walls, fold into a single argument about how human beings make meaning with matter, how we mark time in stone and bronze and earth, and how those marks insist we remain both curious and modest. Think of the archaeological record as a conversation between the past and the present. The past leaves gestures and fragments, often coded in techniques and choices that do not translate neatly into our modern prose. The present deciphers those gestures with tools that grow more refined by the decade: radiocarbon clocks, isotopic maps of travel and diet, ancient DNA that threads lineages through millennia, microstratigraphic analyses that read a single hearth ash as a fingerprint of behavior. Yet even as our instruments sharpen, the past keeps surprising us. What connects the sites we visited is not a single answer but a set of recurring dilemmas: scale and intent, movement and isolation, innovation and continuity, ritual and daily life. In each case a careful measurement, the weight of a stone, the tooth count in a gear, the straits of a geoglyph, the pollen in a sediment core, pushes back against sweeping narratives, demanding instead that we entertain multiple, often competing, interpretations. This is a practice to admire, to hold multiple theories in the air at once, to let statistical models and mythic imagination coexist until data collapses some possibilities and amplifies others. We saw it at Göbekli Tepe, where ritual architecture predates serial agriculture in ways that force us to imagine ritual as engine rather than epiphenomenon. We saw it in the Antikythera pieces, where a battered object rewrites assumptions about how much mechanical ingenuity the ancient Mediterranean could fit into a single device. We felt it in Nazca's plains, where lines that look like messages from the sky might instead be processions across the earth. We watched the drama of environmental agency and human agency play out on Rapa Nui, where monumental commemoration, ecological constraint, and resilient adaptation intersect in complex ways rather than in a single catastrophic arc. We saw systems of power and belief at Stonehenge and Giza, where social organization and cosmology are enmeshed, and at Great Zimbabwe, where indigenous urbanism and global trade weave together to unsettle simplistic histories imposed by earlier scholars. Each site resists being reduced to a single moral or lesson. Each demands that we hold its contradictions without collapsing them into convenient stories. If there is a single methodological thread that binds the best of contemporary inquiry across these mysteries, it is cooperation across disciplines and with descendant communities. Archaeology no longer aims to be a one-person excavation drama. It is an assemblage of specialists, GIS mappers, paleobotanists, geneticists, ethnohistorians, materials scientists, and crucially, living communities whose memories and present-day practices form a dialogue with material remains. Indigenous knowledge keepers often hold lines of explanation that archival science alone can miss: practices of placemaking, ritual continuity, and landscape reading that survive in oral form and can redirect excavation strategies and interpretive frames. The recent shift toward collaborative research, co-curation of artifacts, shared authority and interpretation, repatriation practices that aim to respect descendant claims, is a moral as well as scientific advance. It acknowledges that mystery is not merely an intellectual puzzle to be solved by outsiders, but a living concern for people whose histories were written on stone and buried in earth. That ethical turn matters when we think about sites like Alcatraz, where modern political layers overlay indigenous presence, or Great Zimbabwe, where racist assumptions once misattributed indigenous monumentality to foreign builders. It matters because how we tell these stories shapes how future generations will steward these places. We also learn to love uncertainty as a kind of engine. The unknown is not failure, it is an invitation to better questions and better methods. A mystery that resists easy closure. Why people in a certain era hauled stones hundreds of kilometers, why a sophisticated mechanism appears sporadically in the record, why lines appear that read differently from foot and sky, does not mean there is no explanation. Rather, it means our explanatory frameworks must broaden and our tools must be pointed with more nuance. We need a humility that recognizes the partiality of each dataset and a creative rigor that tries out bold hypotheses in scientifically testable ways: isotopic sourcing to trace mobility, geochemical fingerprinting to locate trade routes, experimental archaeology to test moving techniques, ADNA to map population continuity and admixture, chronometric layering to build aspirationally complete timelines. Those methods have already resolved many puzzles, revealing that people were far more mobile, connected, and inventive than older models allowed, and they will continue to refine our models. Yet every resolution tends to generate new puzzles, because the past contains human variability that never fits one template. Beyond methods and ethics, there is a quieter human lesson stitched through these sites: the way people, across buckets of climate, culture, and chronology, transform felt scarcity into creativity. Drought invites terracing, ambiguous cosmology invites grand ritual, a need for social cohesion invites monument building. The creative energy that chiseled a face on a moai or plotted a line across the Nazca Plain is the same human impulse that makes us tell stories today. These are not relics of alien brilliance but records of ordinary people making extraordinary choices under constraint. They ask us to imagine their priorities not as alien, but as variations of human strategies we still practice: signaling status, securing food, remembering ancestors, claiming territories, seeking comfort against death. The mythic elements, giants, sky people, cursed stones, are not merely errors to be corrected. They are cultural metaphors that encode social knowledge, anxieties, and aspirations. Treat them as windows into human meaning rather than as obstacles to scientific explanation. This is where wonder and skepticism must walk together. Wonder drives the questions we ask at all. What did it feel like to haul a stone? What sound did a community make when it gathered in a carved circle? What aspirations are encoded in the precise teeth of the Antikythera gears? Skepticism keeps us honest, requiring measurement, repeatability, and a readiness to abandon even beloved hypotheses if data contradicts them. The best narratives balance both, and we should applaud and emulate scholars who know when to tell a story and when to let a dataset speak. That temperament, open, curious, disciplined, is also the one civic virtue archaeology invites: to look at patrimony with care, to conserve and sometimes to contest public narratives, to value stewardship over spectacle. Sites become tourist commodities, and tourism has a role in public education and in funding stewardship, but it poses risks of commodification and deterioration. Responsible engagement with archaeological places means balancing access and preservation, using digital replication to share experiences without destroying the original, and funding local custodianship so that descendants and neighbors can decide how their pasts are presented. Finally, let the human scale anchor the philosophical. The grand architectures and small artifacts we examine are not only evidence for theories, they are invitations. They invite us to imagine lives not our own, to hold ambiguity without needing a tidy moral, and to carry forward a practice of curiosity that transforms how we live now. The past speaks through material residues, and each residue asks us a question that often circles our present dilemmas. How will we manage resources? How will we reckon with inequality and prestige? How will we weave ritual and meaning into public life without destroying the ecological basis we depend on? Maybe the greatest service these ancient puzzles offer is not merely intellectual. They offer time-tested mirrors in which we can see variants of contemporary choices and their consequences. To stand in front of a monument, or a geoglyph or a battered mechanism is to accept an apprenticeship in patience. The past rewards careful attention, interdisciplinary humility, and an ethic of care. So go on, be curious deliberately. Support careful conservation and scholarship, listen to descendant communities, and when you encounter the sensational claim, a single-line explanation offered as an epiphany, ask for the data, the radiocarbon lab numbers, the isotopic baselines. Treasure wonder, but let it be disciplined wonder. Visit these places where you can, but also read the published reports, listen to the experts, and ask how the story changes when a new method is applied. Remember that each unanswered question is not a failure of knowledge but an opportunity, a place where a new generation of fieldworkers, modelers, and engaged citizens can test, argue, and sometimes revise the received view. The world's mysteries are not puzzles to be hoarded by a few, they are invitations to collective curiosity, civic stewardship, and a richer imagination about who we are and how we got here. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.